Thank you very much. Well, this is a very exciting panel, I think, because we're turning to the issue of the role of Christianity in providing support and uplift for the most poor and vulnerable and marginalized people in their societies. And we have three panelists here today who are going to be speaking and presenting their papers. And I really encourage you all to read these papers. They are most compelling, I think, and demonstrate the role of Christianity in providing uplift to some of the most marginalized people. And in some respects, it struck me as most appropriate that this panel follows our meeting with Papa Francesco, because his message about the centrality of the Church of the Poor, I think, is reflected in the papers today. And so I'm going to briefly introduce our three panelists, and then we'll have them speak in turn and then have a dialogue. Our panelists are, first of all, Rebecca Shah, who is a research fellow at the Berkley Center on Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and the Religious Freedom Project. She also is heading up a large Templeton-funded project to survey poor women in India and other places around the world, and the role of Christianity and particularly conversion in their economic uplift. And I might say that Rebecca also has worked for the World Bank, and so brings to this project not only a sensitivity to a local networks of poor women in places like India and South Sudan, but also the perspective of a hard-nosed sort of economist-type person who looks at the bottom line. So we'll be hearing from her. Richard Burgess, on my left, is a research fellow at the Center for Pentecostal and Charismatic Studies at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And he's been involved in a large project on the study of Pentecostalism around the world, and has been working with Professor Danny McCain in Nigeria, one of the flashpoints in conflict, in some of the strife we see in the world today. And finally, Sara Singha is a doctoral student, one of our rising scholars at the University of Georgetown, a student in theology. She's from Karachi, Pakistan, and will be talking about the Christian community in Pakistan, and has some fascinating things to say about this deeply indigenous and very ancient community in Pakistan and how they're adapting to the pressures they face. So I want to start with you, Rebecca, and I want to kind of anchor this discussion with this context, that there is a kind of widespread view that perhaps Christianity has been a liberating influence in some respects, in some areas, but that it has perpetuated an oppressive and stifling attitude toward two groups, women and the poor. And with respect to women, it's often said that Christianity is a patriarchal religion. With respect to the poor, we're sometimes told that, well, of course, Christianity teaches the poor will always be with us, and there's nothing particularly that could be done to change their situation. And what I find so intriguing about Rebecca's research, and she's interviewed in her team over 1,000 women, poor women in India and elsewhere, who are under the most struggling circumstances. She finds that particularly women who have converted to Christianity make dramatic advancements. And so I'd like you, Rebecca, to talk a little bit about what's going on and what you think is happening among poor women and the role of conversion to Christianity. And this is particularly poignant in the context of India, where conversion is often either illegal or stigmatized, or in some ways a trigger for mob violence against Dalits, tribals, and poor people in India. So,
thank you, Alan. In the space that you asked me this question, and a few minutes I prepared a PowerPoint.
All right.
Very interesting. But
And move the...
Can everybody hear me? Okay. Well, yesterday, the panels kept you at 1,000 feet, 10,000 feet. You hovered over religious freedom and the areas of religious freedom. You went to the ancient world. You went to the modern world. Perhaps today, I'd like you to take you like the Google Maps, you know, those Google Maps where you can take your cursor all over the earth, and then you can come down to that little fellow at street level and wander through your streets. I love doing that with my children. Well, perhaps today I'd like to take you to a street level view of the impact I see in some of my work of Christian conversion on the very poor women who are at the bottom of the pile. I'd like to say that this research is a pilot study. It shows patterns and directions in which conversion can have a beneficial impact. We're in the process of doing a more rigorous research which will confirm these findings, but certainly this is the direction in which we think conversion leads some of the poor. Before I do that, I'd like to just introduce you to who could be the next Prime Minister of my country, India. His name is Narendra Modi. And the context I'm going to be talking about is India, even though I have done research in South Sudan and Peru, as Alan said earlier. I'd like to concentrate on India because, as Paul Marshall and Todd Johnson said yesterday, there's been a shift in the number of Christians to the global south, and there has been an increase in Christian adherence in India, which is also a very poor country and a country that's increasingly facing persecution. Chad Bauman and James Panaya and other scholars today will go into that in more depth. So this is in Hindi, but I will translate. But I would like you to just have a look at Narendra Modi. Oops. I'm supposed to play it. I guess there's no video. Well, this is supposed to be a video of Narendra Modi, but it doesn't matter. He's being interviewed by this chap, you see, and the fellow asks him, recently there's been a mass conversion of tribals, Dhangs, in Gujarat, in his state. He's the chief minister of the state of Gujarat, and he's now running for Prime Minister of India. The elections are in March. And he's been asked, sir, tell me, what do you think of these growing number of conversions of tribals to Christianity? Of course, there are conversions to Hinduism, but what do you think of these growing number of tribals and Dalits? To which Modi replies in his characteristic, very official voice, and he's very commanding. He says, let me tell you, when someone becomes a Hindu, well, he's just returning home. He's going back home. But if a fellow, he says, decides to adopt a foreign religion, that's when the crisis happens. And he uses those words. He uses the words crisis, and he uses the word Videshi, foreign religion. The people that are converting and the people that I concentrate in my work on, and the people who are converting, are Dalits. Who are these Dalits? Many of you haven't heard the term. Well, the Dalits were called pariahs. They were called outcasts, and then Gandhi called them Harijan, which means God's children. They're also the lowest level. They're actually without caste. They are the Shudras. One is actually born a Dalit, and you cannot leave a Dalit status. You stay, you're born, and you live, and you die a Dalit. Dalits are employed in some of the worst jobs that actually befit their hereditary status. They scavenge, they sweep, they are tanners. They do the smelliest, dirtiest work, and therefore they pollute you. So there's they're untouchables. In 1963, there was an untouchability law. The untouchability was outlawed. However, sadly, segregation does continue. A recent study conducted, a wonderfully, statistically rigorous, excellent study conducted in 2009 by an NGO in India in collaboration with the Robert Kennedy Center with academics from New York and Notre Dame, found that a non-Hindu Dalit priest, often a Brahmin priest, will not, 98% of them will not preside in a Dalit wedding. Dalits are not allowed to go near a temple or touch any religious object that is used in worship. In addition to this sort of untouchability and the lack of anyone following the untouchability law, there was a mandate in 1950 called a presidential order, which said that Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims were restricted from affirmative action because they were not, quote, Indic religions. In 1990, the Sikh community was allowed affirmative action. The Buddhists are allowed affirmative action, but Dalits and Muslims are not. 2 days ago, protesting this restriction, Roman Catholic nuns, bishops, priests, and so forth protested 50 years of this restriction in our capital, Delhi. They were lathi charged, which means they were chased by police with sticks. Many nuns and priests were beaten, and for the first time in 1997, a bishop was arrested. These are the Dalits, these people who are converting. Some people don't want to go back to Narendra Modi's home. They've been kept on the outskirts of this house. They've never been let in. Some of them are not even allowed to come and touch the threshold of the house. So they are converting. They don't want to live on the margins. They are converting to Christianity. And we have a very interesting study that I'll go into. It was called a mass movement study. It was conducted in 1931. And there were mass conversions. So this movement, this conversion began in 1931. I mean, in 1870, there was a mass conversion movement. And we have a wonderful book by Bishop Pickett who did this study. And when asked where he was converted, one Dalit said, "Christ gave me a pagri, a turban, which is a symbol of respect, in place of dust." He was the Dalit from the northwest frontier, which is now in Pakistan, in Pashrur. Today, conversions are taking place, as I told you, among tribals, among Dalits in urban areas. And we know that the volume and the pace of this conversion is so terrifying that there has been an increase in the attacks of pastors who work with Dalits and who work among tribals. And the pace and the volume of conversion among Dalits has been so worrying that the RSS has stepped up its Ghar Vapsi program. Ghar Vapsi means to return home. You know what Narendra Modi was saying. It's Ghar Vapsi program in many key states. And there where Christians who converted presumably in the mass movement time are forcibly being asked to reconvert. So what is the impact, the empowering impact of conversion? I believe that the clearest way to identify the beneficial economic and social outcomes that conversion can generate is to observe what happens when individuals, especially individuals that live in deeply deprived and marginalized existence, in entirely non-Christian contexts like India, convert. And I have a historical precedent. I was telling you about this mass movement study. It's a very large study, and it was done in 1931, primarily because it worried the missionaries, because there were a vast number of Dalits converting, and they wanted the upper caste to convert. So Bishop Pickett conducted this 3,800 household survey, where he found out that Dalits were converting, and the benefits of that conversion was they were sending their children to school. And the long-term impact of this conversion is today that Dalits actually have a higher rate, as you can see, of literacy than Dalit Christians have a higher rate of literacy than Dalit Muslims or Dalit Hindus. I've been told I have a few minutes, so I'm going to rush. But what about now, you say? What's happening now? In our study, I interviewed 300 women over 3 years, and we also conducted 200 interviews in North India. The interesting part is, when we started the study, I did not know that 70 or 23% of the women that I was interviewing were actually converts. And majority of these women are illiterate. They work as maids. They belong to a microfinance program, so they get loans which they use to educate their children or to run small businesses. We interviewed Hindu, Muslim, and Christian Dalits in a very violent urban slum. We found a very unexpected pattern in housing. And housing is very important because these people live in a slum community. It's a transient community. They're originally migrant workers. They had de facto rights to the property, but did not have legally enforceable title. But we found that our converts actually had, I'd like you to disregard the mainland Protestant. It was a very small number, so it's there were only about 10 mainline Protestants, so that is, I'd like you to disregard that data and look at the converts. The converts converted their loans to purchasing houses and turned dead capital, as Hernando de Soto said, into resources to generate additional capital. And what the housing did for them, by being able to own a house, these poor women were able to get bank loans, commercial loans, which they didn't have access to before that. When you have a house, you could get a loan at 3% instead of from a moneylender at 18%. So having a house loan is a very important investment in your future, because you can have access to very affordable credit. A second dramatic, which I say, finding, we found excellent findings. Another dramatic finding I found is in domestic violence. And in the National Family Health Survey in India conducted a survey of women who had experienced domestic violence, and they found that only 1 out of 4 women in India who were victims of domestic violence ever sought help. 86% of women interviewed had never told anyone that they had been abused. But what was interesting in the India-wide data was there was no differential from wealth or education. The only differential came with religion. Only 24% of Hindu women sought help, and 22% of Muslim women, but 32% of Christian women sought help. And our data shows that, in fact, it actually echoes the National Health Survey data, because we see that from our survey that 57% of very healthy number of women, large number of women, actually tell their pastor. And I believe this happens because 2 things. These women are very closely involved and actively involved in their faith community. When they arrive in their weekly prayer meetings and they've got a gash across their face or they're lacking a few teeth, they get noticed. Pastors that are usually male visit the homes, and they repeatedly visit the home. So at some point, the husband who's beating up his wife is shamed into stopping beating his wife. So there's a connection there. It was a very interesting connection, because many of those women, I'm going to sort of beat this whole housing analogy to death, but they actually literally open the doors and bring their pastors into this very violent and very dark situation of their home. So it was a unique finding. We were not looking for this, and we were quite surprised at this finding. These are our women. Malika stands there, and these are the women some of the women we interview. Conversion activates in the converts a powerful new concept of value and initiative through 2 ways. One, through the attitudes and perceptions of the converts towards themselves, and a mutual attitude and perception to the wider community. A wonderful economist who I have great respect for, Glenn Lowry, writes about race, and he says, identity choice is a social event. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides that's who they are. They create it in society. A person who is pessimistic about himself and his circumstances, and who's socially isolated tends to feel victimized and less able and less willing to take risks to improve their lives and to participate. And then they tend to participate in socially destructive and often physically harmful activities which reinforce the view of others that these people are worthless. Such behavior reinforces and sustains the group's isolation from society. Conversion, I believe, one of the ways it can work, it can activate in the poor, such as Maliga and Girija and Rita and all these women I talk, a radically different way of seeing themselves as a new creation, a new identity, made in the image of God, seeking a better life for themselves. The future is not terrifying. It can be achieved because God is with them. They can invest in the future. It's not something to ignore, not something to be terrified of. Second way in which conversion can help is through a combination. I look at microcredits organizations through the access of credit and a new identity. The converts may harness their agency and capability into investing the future to improve their lives. So it changes who they believe themselves to be. It changes their self-conception, their belief in who they are. And secondly, it changes how they can change their family's future and themselves. Poverty is inherently depressing. It's discouraging. It's debilitating. It breeds hopelessness. Why bother? I mean, why bother planning for the future? Because it's going to be horrible and dark anyway. Health insurance. Many people in our slums say, why is it that people don't have health insurance? And especially when a family member has a chronic health condition. Well, the poor are so debilitated and so depressed by the future that they have a sort of head in the sand attitude. Well, I'm not going to do anything. Conversion actually helps launch women on a virtuous circle. A woman feels better, she's part of an active faith community, she works more, she earns more money. The extra money she earns and saves encourages her to earn more and save more and plan and invest in the future, such as buying a house. An increase in income enables her to reach a tipping point which can propel her out of a poverty trap into a more productive pattern of saving. An attitude about oneself and the agency and capability are interrelated because they reinforce each other. I've gone over, I apologize.
That's all right. I hate being it's so difficult. Rebecca brings tremendous insight and passion to this work, and she's interacted with these vulnerable women and has seen their lives transformed. And it strikes me that this echoes a number of themes we've heard throughout our conference about the role of Christianity in supporting the notion of people made in the image and likeness of God as having a surpassing dignity. And that's what Rebecca is finding among these poor women in India and elsewhere who convert to Christianity, that they then feel a new sense of personhood, and it enables them to have a future-oriented perspective. And I also will, if we have time, will pursue the notion that the poor don't just need to have more, they need to be more. And that's what she finds Christianity provides. Next, we turn to another fascinating project. Richard Burgess and Danny McCain have written a chapter called Radical Religion and Ethnocentric Politics, the Toxic Fuel of Religious Intolerance and Violence in Northern Nigeria. And I want to begin by mentioning that Richard's co-author, Danny McCain, is not able to be with us. He was going to be here, but his mother unexpectedly passed away, and he has to be with family, so our prayers are with him and his family. But I wanted to take just a moment to read a passage from the chapter of their fine, from their fine chapter. Danny McCain has been in Jos, Nigeria for 25 years as a pastor and as a professor, and has endured tremendous trials with great grace and sort of pastoral insight. This is a passage from their paper. As I, Danny, walked through the university health clinic, there were dozens of people sitting in line around with various kinds of burns and bleeding injuries. Trails of blood crisscrossed each other down the halls, and bandage wrappers lay where they had been hastily dropped on the floor. The nurses in their white uniforms looked tired. One doctor was shouting in anger for anyone to hear, "Look at this old woman's arm." Who would cut off an old woman's arm like this? She had nothing to do with this. The "this" he was referring to was a violent conflict that had started the afternoon before. It was a result of an on-again, off-again appointment of a Muslim man to an office supposedly reserved for the Christian indigenes in Nigeria's Plateau state. We had received word around noon the day before from a friend that we should not leave our home on campus because there would be trouble in town. Fortunately, we had a relatively calm night. I had heard that there were many casualties, unfortunately, and most of the medical personnel could not get there. I thought I perhaps could help. As I walked around the corner, I saw a lady I recognized. She was the wife of one of my students who had pastored the Emmanuel Baptist Church, one of the closest churches to my house. She said, "Doctor, they burned our church and the parsonage." I decided that I might do more good helping her and her family. As we walked the 10 minutes from the clinic to my house, more and more of the residents of that community fell behind me with babies on their backs, bags on their heads. Just as we reached my house, a heavy burst of gunfire erupted a short distance away. About 30 people rushed into my house, and they and another 40 stayed for a week. This is the life of a pastor in northern Nigeria today. So I want to turn to you, Professor Burgess. Dr. Burgess, excuse me, Richard Burgess, to talk about, you've done impressive research on Pentecostalism in Nigeria, and you've teamed up with this conference to look at the status and role of Christian communities in northern and central Nigeria where Christians have faced growing violence and discrimination. And I'd like you to elaborate on the challenging circumstances and then some of the creative initiatives that Christian leaders have undertaken in response. So, Dr. Burgess.
Just to set the project a little bit in context, Nigeria is evenly divided between Christians and Muslims. The north, which was the focus of our project, is predominantly Muslim, and the southern Nigeria is predominantly Christian. And the middle belt, where Danny and I used to be based in Plateau State, has much larger Christian populations than the far north, which has very small Christian populations. So we need to take this into consideration when thinking about causes behind the crisis, the conflict, the effects on Christian communities, and the responses of Christian communities, because it varies from one place to another. Now here in this map, you see the Sharia states. There's also a distinction that needs to be made between Sharia states who've implemented Sharia law and non-Sharia states. So in the core north, the far north, we have, I think there are 12 Sharia states. Plateau State is non-Sharia. Kaduna State, which was another area of the focus of our research, has partial implementation of Sharia. And the Nigerian constitution has a provision for legal protection and extensive rights to all Nigeria's citizens. It also contains a strong statement on religion, as freedom of religion, that's consistent with modern democracies. And unfortunately, these rights are not always enjoyed by religious and ethnic minorities in some areas of the country. Since the return to democracy in 1999, there have been three main issues that have affected the status and freedom of Christian communities in northern Nigeria. The first have to do with the laws of indigeneity. So indigeneity laws declare certain ethnic groups in each state indigens, thus preventing members from other groups from formally being considered indigents. And one consequence of this is that state governments discriminate against non-indigents in matters concerning, for example, land ownership, which has implications for building churches, political participation, education and employment. The second issue that has affected Christian communities is the whole issue of Sharia law. Now, Sharia law has existed in Nigeria for many years, but until 1999, return of the country to democracy, it had only been applied to domestic and personal law. So what happened in 1999, as the country returned to democracy, the application of Sharia law was applied to criminal law, and effectively in 12 northern Nigerian states, it became a state religion. Islam became the state religion. And since its introduction, existing discrimination against both indigenous and non-indigenous Christian minorities in the north has increased. The third issue is a more recent phenomenon, which is the rise of the Boko Haram insurgency, which has really heightened insecurities and tensions, particularly in the far north, but right throughout Nigeria. Boko Haram, which means Western education is forbidden. It's a Sunni Muslim sect. It claims to, seeking to eliminate all Western influences and create a pure Islamic state ruled by Sharia law. So as well as attacks on moderate Muslims and government institutions, Boko Haram targets Christian communities and churches. And it remains today a significant threat to religious freedom in Nigeria and continues to generate a lot of fear and anxiety among Nigerian citizens, not just in the north, but throughout the country. Recently, the US State Department has designated Boko Haram a foreign terrorist organization. And underlying all these three issues are issues of politics and economics. And it's no coincidence in one of our arguments is that in a poorly implemented democracy, in a traditional hierarchical society where a dominant religion can seriously disenfranchise minority religions. So in northern Nigeria, when democracy was returned, it met a very hierarchical traditional society which had been practicing Islam for hundreds of years. And because the core northern states were overwhelmingly Muslim, they could democratically enshrine Sharia into their state laws, despite it being incompatible with the Nigerian constitution. So Christian communities have experienced in these different regions, in the Middle Belt and in the far north, diverse fortunes as a consequence of violence, Sharia law implementation, and the rise of Boko Haram insurgency. In the core northern states, the introduction of Sharia law has increased existing discrimination against Christians. Churches are denied certificates of land ownership, and which makes construction of church buildings very difficult. There's also increasing discrimination in employment, restricted access to education and social amenities, and barriers to political participation. In some states, Boko Haram is involved in a systematic campaign of religious cleansing through suicide bombings, violent attacks on churches, and so-called silent killings of Christians. And this has forced some communities to relocate. Now, communities from southern Nigeria who've migrated to the north can return to their homes in southern Nigeria. But many of the Christians in the core northern states are indigenous. They have no other home to go to. So they have to leave their jobs, they have to leave their ancestral lands and relocate to a safer environment. For example, many have from the far north have come down to Jos, which relatively safer environment. There's also evidence that Boko Haram is kidnapping women and forcing them to convert. Recently, I think Boko Haram issued an ultimatum for all Christians to convert, leave the region, or die. In Kaduna State, the introduction of Sharia law in 2000 and more recent Boko Haram suicide bombings have resulted, too, in increasing discrimination against Christians, destruction of churches, and extensive loss of lives. In Plateau State, over the past decade, Plateau State used to be a very peaceful environment, Christian and Muslim communities living together in harmony. There was a lot of social cohesion. But in 2001, which is the episode that Danny talks about, I was also there in 2001, didn't have quite the experience that Danny McCain had. That really was the beginning of a decade or so a series of ethno-religious violence between the House of Fulani Muslims and the Christian indigents, and that has continued today. Thousands have been killed as a result. And pastors are reporting that church attendance has declined as a result of this. Some are moving to other areas of Nigeria. Some have just stopped going to church because of the security problems. Now, I have a little bit of time for Christian responses. There's quite a variation on Christian responses. Some are, regard what is happening to them as a religious war. I have heard that term being used by one or two pastors. And those who use that term tend to support the use of arms, not necessarily in retaliation, but certainly in self-defense. And they encourage their members to buy arms for self-defense. I think, if you see on one of the right-hand pictures, the second picture down, it's a church in Jos that was bombed in 2012. And they built these big bollards, concrete bollards, to prevent suicide bombers coming into the church. The same, the bottom right-hand corner is a Pentecostal church which has been attacked by Boko Haram terrorists 4 times, I was told. And again, they've got sandbags and these bollards. So that is one response, and quite understandable. There's some interesting initiatives that, one particular initiative in Jos, started by a Pentecostal pastor called the Young Ambassadors for Community Peace Initiative. I think that is what it's called. This is Yakubu Pam on the right-hand picture there. And what he's done, he in 2001, around the time of the eruption of the Jos crisis, he regarded himself as a Christian radical, and he actually advocated retaliation at that time. But since then, his church was in a predominantly Muslim area in Jos, and he began to change his attitude and began to befriend local Muslims. He started to encourage his church members to reach out to help the poor in the community. And out of this, he started to form strong relationships with Muslims, young people, and elderly in the community. So on a subsequent episode of conflict, local Muslims actually protected his church from Muslims coming from outside. So he has started this initiative where he recruits or trains young people who are often at the forefront of the violence in Jos on the Muslim and the Christian side, and he calls them young ambassadors for peace. And there are some pictures there. He's organized a community-wide peace rallies involving Muslim and Christian young people. Football is Nigerians' national sport, I suppose. So they've organized the Jos peace cup, which involves both Muslims and Christians. What is interesting about this is that they are not trying to convert Muslims to Christianity, but they are working with, particularly with young people in both communities. And listening to him talk and reading about this initiative, it does seem to have reduced levels of violence in Jos. If I had more time, I would also talk about another area of Christian response is in social initiatives. So there are Christian communities and Christian leaders who are engaged in relief work among Christians and Muslims, in reconstruction of villages around Jos that have been destroyed in the conflict, rebuilding. This is just my final picture of a village just outside Jos, which was attacked, a Christian village attacked by local Fulani herdsmen, many women, children, and men killed. And this Pentecostal pastor and his church have gone into the village and built, I think, built about 100 new homes, a school and a community place as well, and a health center.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burgess. And it is really, I really recommend this paper to you all, because it's both a challenging story, an inspiring story, but also a cautionary one about the challenges that Christians face in sort of trying to remain faithful to their calling, but also to respond to very difficult circumstances. Finally, I turn to Sara Singha, who has conducted extensive she is from Pakistan. She has conducted extensive field work there. And it's another country where the socio-political climate has deteriorated in significant ways, and there are growing pressures on the Christian community. And what I like, Sara, about your work is that you focus not only what is happening to Pakistani Christians, but how they are working to address the challenges they face, and also some of the theological innovations. So I wanted you to give some insight into what you've discovered about the Pakistani Christian community, and perhaps something of their sense of heritage as well in Pakistan, which is a very interesting story.
I will talk about their heritage, but just to sort of give a background and contextualize some of the experiences of Christians in Pakistan. One of the things that I want to kind of frame about Pakistan in general is that since its establishment, there has been a very heavy state of anxiety in the nation about the relationship between religion and the state. What is the meaning of an Islamic republic? Who defines the parameters of an Islamic republic? Who is having the conversation and leading the nation as an Islamic country? We've seen 3 or 4 different constitutions since partition. Each constitution has become, in some ways, less favorable to religious minorities, so in that sense more Islamized. And this just really trying to work out how are we going to define our parameters of being an Islamic nation, and what does that mean? There's very vague language in these constitutions, things like, the constitution must be defined by Islamic principles, but it doesn't really say what Islamic principles are or who's responsible for defining those Islamic principles. We've seen the creation of an ulama council. The ulama council is supposed to advise the government on matters of Islamic principles. So if there are laws in the nation that are going against the nature of Islam, the ulama is supposed to rein the sort of government in and say, we can't do this. But the ulama councils change with civilian governments, they change with military leadership, and so there hasn't even been a standard ulama council. During this entire sort of tug of war between what it means to be an Islamic nation and how an Islamic republic is defined, we do have religious minorities in general, not just Christians, but also Shias, Ahmadis, basically feeling the effects of these discussions and these changes in the religious environment. So what we see in Pakistan is, shifts in, sometimes there's religious freedom, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there are state-issued discrimination. Sometimes the discrimination is more social, and the prejudice and biases that people feel happen in rural environments, sometimes in urban centers, and they're more socially is sort of encountered, but sometimes it's really political and constitutional stuff. So to give you an example of two sort of things, one constitutional way in which freedom has diminished for Christian communities is one of the constitutions specifically says that in order to be a president of Pakistan, a person has to be a Muslim, a practicing Muslim. Now, it does not put any restrictions on, for example, somebody can be non-Muslim if they want to be Speaker of the House. It hasn't really happened, but there's no restriction on it. And the interesting thing about the Speaker of the House is that the Speaker of the House can stand in for the President if the President is absent. So there's no restrictions on that. But there were new laws that also said that in order to be a member of Parliament, one has to be a practicing Muslim. So there are laws like that that are constitutionally supported, but then in other ways there are restrictions on Christian practice, which are just sort of more social things that don't really have anything to do with the Constitution. So for example, in the Constitution, there's actually no ban or restriction at all on church building. Churches can be built anywhere. Churches are built quite often. But then at the same time, we hear in the news, and we've seen that there are churches that are also attacked. There's a church that was just recently bombed in Peshawar a few months ago. And also there are communities, depending on whether they're in urban slums or in rural areas, where sometimes there are churches that have problems. So a neighborhood doesn't want a church to be built in a particular area, so that pastor in that community might have an issue. On the same, on the other hand, there are colonial churches that are also restored by the government, and there are also churches that have applied and appealed to the government. They say that there's churches being built in a particular slum, and they are having problems with their neighbors. The government has actually been very good with providing security, providing rangers, providing military. So there are many ways in which Christians are responding to the challenges in front of them, and one of the things that Alan wanted me to talk about is a theological response that has emerged from the community. This is an interesting shift which comes from a story from South India, actually, the story of St. Thomas the Apostle, who it is believed in the Eastern Orthodox Church in South India that St. Thomas has traveled to Kerala, the very tip of South India, in 52 AD in the 1st century, where he established a church. This church is known as the St. Thomas Church. It's very well established in India, and a similar story has emerged in Pakistan that before St. Thomas went to India, he also traveled into the region which is now Pakistan, up into the mountain areas in a place called Taxila, and there he established the first Christian community in the region which is now Pakistan. This is a story that the Christians really uphold. It's something that when I was doing my research, I heard them talk about over and over again, basically drawing their lineage to being an indigenous group and being an indigenous religious tradition. Because one of the things that this does is when they are attacked as being outsiders or being foreign members of an outside religion or a foreign religion, they hearken back to the story and can basically say, well, actually, not only has Christianity been here since the 1st century, but what that really means is Christianity has been in this land prior to Islam. So it is therefore an indigenous religion. And one of the pastors that I was talking to when I was conducting research, and I was asking him about blasphemy law and how things like that are affecting his community, and he said this very interesting thing. He said, the Muslims in Pakistan need to understand that this is actually a sacred land for Christians, and they are our guests. So it's very interesting how these sort of mythological and polemical stories play out in community relations, Muslim-Christian relations, and things of that nature. Am I out of time?
No, you have to.
Okay. So Christians are responding in many unique ways. There is a theological response that's coming out of some of the communities, largely Protestant communities, but also there's institutions. So we have, one thing about the Christian community in Pakistan is that they're very visible. Churches are very much a part of the landscape. We have old colonial churches that have been there for a very, very long time that are part of the integrity part of, people recognize them. They're large cathedrals, both Catholic and Protestant. But there's also many social institutions, educational institutions. The education system in Pakistan is the Christian education system is extremely vast. The majority of the schools are Catholic, but there are a number of Protestant colleges and universities. These are the premier schools mostly for Muslim students. So the interesting thing about these schools is that they're very highly regarded, very well respected, but they're also private and they're expensive, and so not a lot of Christians can actually afford to attend. Now, they do have some scholarship programs where Christians are able to attend these schools, but by and large, they are attended by the wealthy elite Muslim families, and they're held in very high regard, not just because they have Western-style education and their education is considered to be excellent, but also I've heard Muslim families say that it's because of the moral education that these schools impart. The schools are, they're run by bishops, they have nuns who are on staff. Many Muslims have expressed that the particular moral training that these schools instill in their children is something that they want. They want their children to be part of that environment. We have many medical institutions, orphanages, midwife clinics, hospitals, everything that is very recognizably Christian, Sacred Heart Hospitals, Seventh-day Adventist Hospital, that are an integral part of the Pakistani community and the country, and extremely well regarded by the government and the Muslim people.
Very good. Well, one of the things I really liked, thank you, Sara. I really liked about Sara's paper is that we do hear a lot about the tremendous pressures on the Christian community, the blasphemy law, the way in which Christians are targeted sometimes by mob violence. But what she provides is a sense of the disproportionate civic contributions of the Christian community to Pakistan. And also I might ask you just to follow up on one point about the role of Christians in the founding of Pakistan, which is not something that I think people really well understand. So just
Sure.
Briefly say something about that.
The Christians played a very large role in the establishment of Pakistan. The Muslim League was extremely anxious in United India right before partition because they did not want to be treated like a minority once the British left India. They were very concerned about what would happen to their rights if they were left under a Hindu majority nation. And one of the things that they were very concerned about was a separate electorate system, because although it was supposed to introduce a way of leveling the playing field, okay, we'll give Muslims separate electorates because Muslims know how to vote for Muslim issues, but it made them feel like they were actually being discriminated against. And when the idea of separate electorates was introduced, it was something that the Christian community at the time, which was organized under the All India Christian Association, was also very sensitive about this separate electorate issue. And they thought that, well, okay, Hindus have a caste system. What's going to happen to us as a minority tradition if we're left in this country and we're part of this caste system, or we become part of the larger sort of dynamics of the caste system? And with Muslims, they were very drawn to the idea of the Islamic Ummah, of equality, of justice, of being protected, of Jinnah's rhetoric, of, one of his most famous speeches is, you can go to your temples, you can go to your mosques, we are all equal in the eyes of the state. And so the Christians joined forces with the Muslim League and voted in favor of Pakistan. And one of the things that people don't realize is that the white part of the flag in the Pakistan flag does stand for minorities, specifically for Christians. And that was their contribution to, basically the vote for Pakistan won by 3 votes, and those 3 votes were Christian votes. So without those 3 votes, it's arguable whether there would be a Pakistan. Jinnah had also reached out to the Sikh community. He had also reached out to the Dalit community. The Dalit community decided to stay in India. The Sikh community was quite nervous about voting in favor of Pakistan, but the Christians did vote not unanimously, but largely in favor of Pakistan, which accounts for their large numbers today.
Thank you. I want to, before I turn back to Rebecca Shah, I wanted to have you, Richard, say a little bit more about sort of you are very forthright in your chapter in talking about the fact that some Christians, especially Christian youth, have reacted with reprisals against Muslims. There have been incidences of Christian violence against Muslim communities in reaction to the pressures. So you're very forthright about describing that, and I'd like to know something of how Christian leaders from different denominations have responded to try to deal with this. You gave one example of the Pentecostal pastor. Perhaps you could elaborate on something of that.
Yeah. Again, I have to start with the fact that some leaders are exacerbating the problem in terms of inflammatory remarks in the media, which sometimes doesn't help, and also a militant stance in their sermons sometimes. I talked to one pastor who found this very difficult, but he in Jos and in the immediate aftermath, I think, of the Boko Haram Christmas car bombs in which one of his churches in Jos, in a denomination he is pastor of, was attacked. He found it very difficult, but he chose to preach forgiveness and tolerance towards other religions, even though he struggled with this. And I think his honesty was very moving to me, because I think, if members of your family have been killed or your church has been destroyed, it's very difficult. But he said that he would preach from the scriptures tolerance, forgiveness, peace, because this is what Jesus modeled for us. So I think that is one way they are doing this. I've mentioned engaging Christian and Muslim youth as peace ambassadors. There are several of these kind of organizations. Pentecostal, from other denominations as well, some working with women, bringing together Muslim and Christian from these different communities. And I think this is important. Another way of approaching this, adopted by some, is through educating Christians about Islam. And one or two of our pastors we spoke to said a part of the problem is ignorance. Our people don't understand Islam. So there's an organization called Reconciliation Trainers Africa, which it goes to communities and brings together community leaders, including Muslims and Christian church leaders. It has Muslim trainers on its staff, as well as Christian trainers. And part of what it's trying to do is educate community leaders. Some church leaders are encouraging their members to actually make friends with Muslims, and I think that is having some effect in certain areas. It's not so easy in the far north, but and to reach out with acts of kindness in terms of practical social care to the poor.
Thank you so much. And I want to now turn to something fascinating that both Sara and Rebecca mentioned to me, and that's the ways in which, especially the Dalits, the untouchables in India, and prior to that in Pakistan as well, which was a part of India, how they've developed a unique theology. So this was very intriguing to me and actually quite compelling. So I thought, Rebecca, you might share something about Dalit theology. And of course, the word Dalit, as I understand it, means broken or shattered. Crushed. And so the image of a broken, shattered, and crushed Christ becomes an intimate part of Dalit theology. So you might describe a little bit how that
You're
has evolved.
asking an economist to do theology?
Well, maybe I'll...
That's beyond my pay grade, but still. I think the Dalit theology arose because despite the segregation, the untouchability law, the caste restrictions persisted within the Christian community, and it persists until today. Dalit Christians are still relegated to some of the worst jobs, and they are still seen as untouchable among the upper caste Christians. And so this was a cause of great concern, and anxiety, and it really, really was very upsetting for Dalit Christians. And in the 70s, and my father was very actively involved. That I was very young, but I've read about Dalit theology. They began to embrace the broken Christ as someone who was broken with them, but emerged victorious and is with them, and who they lift up as someone who is a champion of their cause. So in their brokenness and in their complete deprivation and marginalization, they leaned to and leant on and embraced the broken Christ who lifted them up. And so that it was a wonderful way in which they transformed their real anger into something that was empowering. And there are many Dalit theologians. Samuel Jayaraj in the Madras Christian College has written a lot about this. They've encouraged Dalit priests, Dalit Anglican priests, Dalit Catholic priests to embrace this Dalit theology and to use it as a means of empowering the poor. Right. And I'm sure Sara will continue and talk about that in Pakistan.
That's exactly right. They embrace the brokenness of Jesus, because in that moment of being on the cross where Christ is actually crucified is where the Dalits, their theological point is that that's when Christ becomes fully Dalit. That's when Christ realizes his Dalit nature, so the nature of all humanity to be completely crushed and to be completely broken in a way. And that brokenness is what allows then for the re-emergence of life, the reintegration of life. But that brokenness becomes very important. And it's also a point for which the community has been critiqued because of their sort of overemphasis on being broken and on being crushed, and so the emphasis being too much on the brokenness of Christ and not enough on the redemptive qualities. That is one of the critiques of Dalit theology. But one of the other things that they do in their theological movements is they flip a lot of categories. So in the Hindu caste system, for example, if we look at it as a pyramid, we have the Brahmins at the top and we have the Dalits. They're actually without caste, as Rebecca said, but they're at the bottom of the pyramid. So one of the things that Dalit theology will do is flip that. And if you flip the pyramid, then what happens is it's the Dalits who are on top and the Brahmins who are at the bottom. And this is part of their movement of counter theology. It's about flipping very, very well-known Hindu motifs and Hindu elements and using it in their Christian theological sort of assimilating them into Christian theological language.
Very good. Well, I want to just say a couple of words about the project I'm actually involved in, which is looking at the role of the Christian community in South Sudan. And then I'm going to have a question for Rebecca here on that. But the new nation of South Sudan, which was proclaimed in 2011, is the world's newest country. And it was born out of international Christian advocacy. The peoples of South Sudan had faced a decimating civil war, almost a genocidal war for 2 decades, and have emerged as an independent nation. But this nation is very fragile, devastated by war, bereft of infrastructure, afflicted by continuing internal tribal strife, and weakened by corrupt government and beset by military pressure on its border. And it's not clear to me that South Sudan can take or can hold. But what was clear to me in my own field research is that the Christian community there, the Christian leaders, heroic in their efforts, and the Christian international NGOs are actually providing a lot of the challenge to corruption, providing education and opportunity, healing the shattered lives of people, building civil society, promoting reconciliation, and helping to fashion an identity for the people of South Sudan. So if South Sudan holds, to me it will be because of the Christian presence. And Rebecca, you actually have conducted some of your research in South Sudan, and so we've shared field work in that country. I thought you might just share something of what you've discovered about the role of Christian networks among poor women in this really fragile new country.
Well, we talked about this the other night, Alan, and you and I both agreed that the country as it stands is in such a fragile state that if it weren't for the Christian organizations working there, we don't think that this country is going to make it. There's absolutely no infrastructure. When I was there, they had only 5 miles or 10 miles of paved road.
In a country the size of France.
In the country, it's a massive country. Mm-hmm. It's a very rich country. The Nile goes through it. It's called the White Nile. They have the most fertile soil. They are the largest number of pastoralists, and yet their cows yield only 1 or 2 liters of milk, because there's nobody who's teaching them how to train and grow their produce and add value added. But what I did notice, and I've involved with the Episcopal Church of Sudan, and that's called so because there's still people, even though the country is a new country in South Sudan, we still have a large number of Christians in the north, so we call it the Episcopal Church, ECS of Sudan, and they actually are the ones, along with the very active presence of the Catholic Church, who I was a joy to visit with and be part of there too, are providing the services, the basic services, the health, the education. One finding I have from my study is, in the midst of absolute deprivation, I mean, we have measures of deprivation. They live on houses where there's a dirt floor. They cook with fuel. They are uneducated. They've had at least 1 or 2 children who've died. So in all the measures of deprivation, they're deprived, seriously. They have children who are going to school, and they're going to church-run schools in English. And when I asked the people, I said, why English? And the mothers speak Arabic. Why English? They said, because English is going to be these children's ticket to a better future, the English language. So they may have no money, but as you saw, Alan, they may live in huts which are leaking, but every morning, and these schools are not cheap, they're not free. They have to pay for church schools, and the church provide excellent schooling. The teachers come from Uganda and Kenya, but the schools, the children are getting English education. So who's to say? Church provided schools? In the future, 20 years down, these children could be the difference for this country.